Welcome back. The Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Eric Levitz. He's an associate editor at New York Magazine. Eric, how you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Doing well, Eric. Thanks again for joining us. You have a new piece out, Why We Must Cancel Everyone's Student Debt for the Economy's Sake. What's the basic case here?
Sure. Well, basically, to start off with, we just basically added $1.5 trillion to our public debt for the sake of distributing hundreds of billions of dollars to the wealthy and corporations. And the justification for this policy was that, this is going to spur economic growth and increase wages, and thus, we're all going to benefit. Like, even if you kind of have a knee-jerk objection to giving Wyatt Koch a few billion more dollars in inheritance, ultimately the net effect of throwing all this cash into the economy is going to benefit everybody, so why are you complaining?
And make more great, amazing, just really discoteca shirts that are amazing.
Yeah, exactly. So
Right.
I think that the logic of that argument really applies so much more powerfully to the idea of canceling all student debt, which ironically is about the same, is about as costly a proposition. It's $1.4 trillion of outstanding debt right now. So for a slightly less money, we could wipe out all this debt. And there's this new study from the Levy Institute of the Levy Economic Institute of Bard College, which actually these progressive economists, Marshall Steinbaum, Stephanie Kelton, who used to advise Bernie Sanders, or maybe still does among them, basically ran the numbers on what would happen if the government, which actually owns about 90% of all student debt, just forgave all that debt and bought out the private holders of it, so wiped out that $1.4 trillion. What would happen to the economy? And what they find is that, right now that student debt is depressing consumer demand in a profound way. Right now you have so many young households that are so burdened by their student debt that they're not buying cars, they're not buying houses, and maybe even more critically, they're not having kids, and not engaging in all the consumption that proceeds from starting a family. And so what this is doing is, really dampening consumer demand and dampening economic growth. And so if we were to wipe all that out, by their calculations, we would increase real GDP by as much as, or by between 860 trillion over 10 years to something over 1 trillion, while also creating about 1.2 million jobs a year and reducing the unemployment rate over time by up to about 1/3%. So significant macroeconomic benefits.
We are extremely not worried about deficits on this show, but in standard media discourse somehow, we were just playing it before, somehow Maria Bartiromo was leveraging the recently passed spending bill to keep government going as a new opening of the flank for Paul, and it was portrayed as, she was grilling Paul Ryan, but of course it's right where he wants to go, the next phase of attacks on America's very small social safety net. That will probably be one of the main, if this issue starts to gain any public, broader public traction, and we'll get to that later, the first objection, kind of knee-jerk thing to anything that would benefit the economy and society is, the deficit. So is there a specific answer to that?
I don't think there is, aside from, just pointing out, again, this is the exact same price as those tax cuts. And so, if it's okay for them to do that, why isn't it? Basically just, using the Republican behavior in office to argue that, apparently we all believe that deficits don't matter now. And I really don't think that the deficit actually is the biggest obstacle to this political proposition.
Oh, definitely
I think the real problem
biggest. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Just that the real problem is that there are real inequities inherent to this proposal that are going to trouble a lot of people for understandable reasons, at least on first brush. Obviously they're the people who just paid off their $300,000 in student debt, or even smaller amounts than that, but who have for years been making these sacrifices and living this austere existence so that they could pay off theirs. And then now people are getting these things forgiven. And then additionally, those who did not have the opportunity to go to college and chose specifically not to go to college because they felt they couldn't afford it, and now are seeing their financial probity turn into this actual terrible mistake that their lives would have been so much better if they had realized that the debt wasn't real. So there are these real legitimate resentments that this could create, and I think that my point is just that getting perspective, both in terms of this tax cut and broader, just fighting this idea of what I think you can call status quo bias, right? Which I think Matt Brunig years ago about reparations wrote a really solid piece on this, but just about how people were really made uncomfortable at the idea of well, what if a reparations benefits this rich black family, and you're transferring money from poor white people to rich black people or something, or this specific instance, whatever. But that's all on the presumption that doing anything, basically that this idea of do no harm, even if in the aggregate you're doing good. So he argued basically, look at imagine that we were living in the post-reparations world. Would anybody argue that it would be more just to go from that world to our current one, that it would be more just to redistribute because some African-American families now have more than maybe we think that they should or something, that we should take all that money and give it back, So I think a similar idea applies here, that even if there are losers, the post-student debt jubilee world is a more just world than the one that we currently live in.
Right. It will open up new economic activity, jobs, and wages for everyone.